Who am I? My name is Cory Jenks. I'm a pharmacist, and I am not normal. I'm not a normal I'm as normal as, we're all a little bit off, but I'm not a normal pharmacist because I'm a pharmacist, but I'm also an improv comedian. I know pharmacists, so many of us are known for our sense of humor, but yes, I'm an improv comedian. I'm an author. I published a book in 2022 called Permission to Care, Building a Healthcare Culture That Thrives in Chaos, where I applied the skills of improv comedy to healthcare. I'm also very into fitness and nutrition. How many pharmacists work out regularly? I'll show the guns off. How many pharmacists are also trying to get their patients off their medications actively? That is me. I am a metabolic health practitioner with the Society of Metabolic Health Practitioners here in the United States. I practice in Tucson, Arizona, and I am a weirdo because I tell my patients I want to get you off meds. And then I speak to them like a human being because I'm a pharmacist that does comedy, and I apply my skills to humanize and empathize with my patients. And so I don't know what else there is to say, personally, professionally, but that it's okay to be a little off, a little bit different as a pharmacist. And that's who I am. I'm a weirdo. I'm not normal, and I love taking care of my patients. I love making them laugh. I love getting them off medications.
Hello, and welcome to the latest edition of the ProLongevity podcast. And in those immortal words, and now for something completely different. As you can see, I have with me today not just another atypical pharmacist who, like me, believes in lifestyle over drugs, but possibly unique in the pharmacy profession because we're notorious for having no sense of humour. A low-carb pharmacist with a sense of humour. Welcome, Cory Jenks.
Thank you very much. I feel we have found our counterparts across the pond. There's one pharmacist that prescribes with a sense of humor in the UK, and you found the one here in America. So it's a great thing that we were able to meet, and we're here today.
Both of us met up primarily at the UK Low Carb conference, and we'll talk a bit more in detail about that. But I thought we'd start, Cory. Perhaps you'll talk about your own journey and why we talk about atypical antipsychotics. Hopefully, of us currently need those, but how did we both become atypical pharmacists? So what was your journey, Cory, to A, low carb, and B, having a sense of humour? Because that's drilled out of us pharmacists, ostensibly.
Well, I guess I'll start with the low carb side and I'll get into the humor side. So the low carb world, I graduated pharmacy school in 2011 here in the United States from the University of South Carolina. Was kind of going down a traditional path. I did a pharmacy practice residency. Eventually ended up working in ambulatory care or primary care, so essentially embedded in a clinic with a physician or a nurse practitioner, where I get to prescribe drugs. So under we call a collaborative practice agreement, and mostly what I was doing was diabetes. I'm going to use air quotes here for those listening: diabetes management or chronic disease management. Right? Pharmacists are tasked with adjusting medicines to manage these quote progressive chronic illnesses, hypertension, diabetes, etc. And it was the end of 2015, actually due to my sense of humor. I was listening to a comedy podcast and heard a gentleman by the name of Vinny Tortorich, whose whole thing was no sugars, no grains, on the Adam Carolla show. And my wife's a nurse practitioner. We've always been kind of into health. We've been curious. And we just started looking into this path of no sugar, no grain. We weren't necessarily unhealthy. We weren't struggling with weight, but we're always looking for a new thing to try and experiment and challenge ourselves with. And I think that I echo so many people in the low carb metabolic health world, where you start reading some things and hearing some things and you can't unsee them. You listen to the people, the Nina Teichels of the world, Gary Taubes, Jason Fung. Those are sort of our gateway drugs. I'm a pharmacist, so we'll use the gateway drug. And we started living that lifestyle in 2016. It's 7 years later, 7 years and 2 kids and one on the way later. My wife feels great. I feel great. The weight side of things personally never really was an issue, but we'll talk about maybe mental health a little bit later. Pharmacists can be a little high strung if you've ever met some of us, a little type A. And I would say that I really chilled out with how once I was eating this way, and then I can't look back. And so that's how I practice currently. Is I work in a clinic currently where we do quote diabetes management, but I always offer the option to patients to work on their diet to get off medicines rather than continue to pile them on. So that's my journey in a very quick nutshell. The little spark, the curiosity, and going down that road.
Tell me a little bit more about the pharmacist qualification, because you guys, we do a bachelor's of pharmacy. It's a 5-year degree, followed by what we call a practice year or a pre-registration year. And there's a very stringent exam at that. So a stem cell pharmacist in the UK takes a minimum of 6 years. And I think that's very much fair, first-based. How does that compare with the US? And how I think it varies because we have one national service and one national education. Of course, in the US, it depends on the state. So how different would your experience be than someone who went to pharmacy school in a different school of pharmacy in a different state?
Yeah. So for me, pharmacy schools in America now, everyone graduates with a doctor of pharmacy or a PharmD. And the schools vary. The pharmacy school itself varies from 3 to 4 years, depending on some schools just run you around and get you out in 3 years. And before that, there's a number of prerequisite classes you have to take, and that varies from school to school. For me, I did 2 years of prerequisite undergrad classes, so chemistry, biology, physics, math, and I got to take like 2 liberal arts classes. So I didn't come out exactly super well-rounded. So I did the 2-year pre-pharm and then went right into pharmacy school. So I got done in 6 years, and then we'd have pharmacy residencies here in America that can be anywhere from 1 to 2 years. So I did a residency afterwards. So it was a total of 7 years of training for me. I know that a lot of schools now, basically with the amount of prerequisites they require, 3 to 4 years of prereqs and then 3 to 4 years of pharmacy school. And that varies state to state, school to school, depending on their particular structure.
So you're it takes 6 years, and then do you have to do a year? Does that include a year of practice, or is that after? Residency comes after?
So the year of practice is embedded with each pharmacy school. So I did basically 3 years in the classroom and then a year of practice. We call them rotations or clerkships. So I did 9 different month-long rotations in my final year of pharmacy school. And not everyone here, and then I graduated. And from there, many people just go on and work. I don't say just, they choose to go on and work. I chose to do an extra year of training, which they say crams 3 to 5 years of experience into 1 year. It was a busy year for me working in a hospital system, inpatient, outpatient, ambulatory care, just getting a lot of one-on-one patient experience, but also administrative experience as well, getting the full view of what pharmacists can do here in the United States. And then from there, I went on and work like a normal pharmacist.
And there's been a radical change recently in the UK in that all our new graduates will come out as prescribers from day one.
Oh, wow. See, this is what happens when I'm in my, American bubble. That's great.
Yeah.
It's exciting.
What percentage of US pharmacists would be prescribers?
So I couldn't give you a number, but it's a very small percentage. I think most of us go into the community setting or the hospital setting where you're either community, it's just mostly dispensing a lot of immunizations. Hospital, it's a lot of med prep, and then there's a decent amount of clinical pharmacy giving input to inpatient medical teams. But what I do in the ambulatory care world, it's a challenge because every state's rules are different and laws are different. So for our federal pharmacists that work either for our Veterans Association or our national Indian health organizations, they have that prescribing authority. I'm actually in a private practice that has managed to get a prescribing authority for me. So it's a little bit unique, but not a big percentage.
And did you have to do extra qualifications to get your prescribing certification?
This depends on the institution. So I think that for most, if you've done a year of residency or a year or 2 of residency, they will consider that qualified. I know pharmacists that have done 0 residency, 0 additional training. They have their PharmD. They get hired by an organization to do what I do, and they get on the job training. So it really varies. There's no standardized exam to be a prescriber necessarily.
That's interesting. So, and I'm not sort of making out the case that one's better than the other, that they're different and alternative. So I'm not a prescriber because when I qualified, it wasn't even available. If I was qualifying today, I would absolutely be a prescriber. We have 3 pharmacies now, and 2 of the pharmacies are run by pharmacists with independent prescribing qualifications. So they do a postgraduate diploma effectively, and it can be 1 or 2 years to give them that prescribing qualification. Unlike our GP colleagues who can essentially prescribe anything from the British National Formulary, you end up come up with a specific scope of practice. So you do an IP course, independent prescribing course, and then you choose what area you want to cover as part of that course, and that becomes your initial scope of practice. And then as you build extra skills, you can grow your scope of practice. So it goes stepwise. So it's cautious, but it's safe. And I think that, as I say, the fact that, of course, it will take a long time, because currently within current qualified pharmacists, the number of IPs, it's probably 50% in secondary care. But the overwhelming majority of pharmacists work in primary care, and it's probably no more than 10%. So it's going to take at least a decade, if not more, for the majority of pharmacists to have prescribing. But I think that's very exciting. I mean, I think that's game-changing for our profession.
I agree, especially here in the United States, where so much of pharmacy has been traditionally a dispensing role, in that clinical side of our brains where we're the med experts, and we can debate whether the merits of escalating medicines in certain disease states. But for us too, we have pharmacists that do pharmacy practice residencies in like mental health and cardiology, infectious disease. So you mentioned with your pharmacist having a very small, specific, narrow scope, and then building from there. That's very similar to what we have. Like I don't do oncology, but we have pharmacists that do adjust oncology medicines because they have that additional year of training for their scope of oncology, for example.
And I think the other thing that we have that is not the case in the US is we have a whole category of medicines called pharmacy only. Mm-hmm. There are a group of medicines that are a sort of intermediate groups. They're not available everywhere. They're only available in a pharmacy, and the pharmacist needs to have a degree of control over that. Whereas I think in the US, it's either prescription or it's general sales, and there's kind of nothing in between.
Yeah, and I think there's a few medicines that are floating into the pharmacists can prescribe. It's something that doctors and pharmacists can prescribe, but it's in the pharmacy. If you just go directly to the pharmacy, we can basically, based on some assessments, dispense it. But again, that scope is so narrow, and my particular area of expertise and where I work is outside of that setting. So I don't want to speak on something that I might be very wrong on. But I know I hear that in our trade magazines and articles and things like that.
You've covered it briefly, but what inspired you to become an atypical pharmacist in the sense of de-prescribing and low carb? Because that's just not where our training leads us, is it?
It's not. And much like most healthcare professionals that are nutritionists, we don't get a ton of nutrition training. I think what led me down the path is I started learning about this stuff, and you can't unsee it. And then you hear stories of people improving. And I think the thing that really solidified it for me, and I had a buddy that was at Low Carb Denver along with me, who's a pharmacist. And I turned him onto this. And at the time I was doing mostly an order verification role. So I wasn't in direct patient care, but he was. And he started reading the books, reading the literature, reading the science, started implementing with his patients. And he said, Cory, in the 3 months I've been doing this, I've had more patients come off insulin than in the last 8 years of my career. And so when you see the results, and I think that for me, the thing that inspired me is when I was early in my career and you don't see people getting better, you're just sort of like, it's like bailing out a boat that's taking on water. You're just keeping it from sinking. So when you can reverse it,
they keep getting worse, but you try and slow down the rate of, they're sinking more slowly under the waves of illness that's going to envelop them. Yeah.
Yes. And giving patients their lives back, getting them, because I've never met a patient. Yeah. I won't say never. I have a few patients. Some of them are my own family members that say, give me the cookies, give me the glipizide. And I'm like, all right, great. That's fine. But very few people enjoy taking medicines and having their lives ruled by medicines. And so I think it was Dr. Glant at the conference we were at gave the case discussion of one of her patients that A1C was controlled, but was on 15 medicines. Is this success? Right? That's the question. And the numbers say yes, but the patient would say no. Their lives are ruled by these meds. And so when you can give patients their life back, and I got into pharmacy to help people, and I thought medicines would do that, and sometimes they can, but better than that is getting them off medicines and giving them the freedom to live and be vibrant.
I completely agree with you. The definition, that patient on 15 different meds, that's the definition of success for the pharma industry, right?
Yeah,
And
exactly.
Increasingly cynical about the way the system works and what our definitions of success are. So if that wasn't weird enough, you've got a sense of humor as well. So, what went so tragically wrong for you? How did you end up in this terrible place?
Well, I grew up watching a lot of comedy. So over here, I was a kid. From 5 years old, whether for better or worse, I had a TV in my room. So I was watching The Simpsons at age 5. And I loved comedy, The Simpsons, Saturday Night Live. And I always enjoyed it. Would quote it, Mondays after the weekend, watching it on the weekends. And I got to college and there was an improv comedy group. So many people who maybe have seen improv has been, whose line is it anyway? And there was an improv group on campus. I went to it, mind blown. So naturally, as a dutiful pharmacist, I said, I'll do that when I'm done with school because I have to focus on my studies because, my left brain took over. But when I finished school, I was dating my wife at the time, and she wanted to get me a birthday present. And I asked for improv classes. And so I had time. I'd finished my studies, my residency. She was in grad school to be a nurse practitioner. So it really worked out great that she was busy. I started taking classes, had fun. It was totally a different environment of healthcare where everything's no improv. The whole idea is yes and we agree and we build together. And from 2013 to about 2018, I joke I got my improv comedy master's degree because I was teaching, coaching, performing. I was at our theater 4 or 5 nights a week here in Tucson. And the cool part, fostering that sense of humor, that itch I'd had since I was a kid, was that it translated to my pharmacy practice. So it wasn't just, I can make patients laugh when it's appropriate and when they need it. But a lot of improv is listening, being in the moment, empathizing. And so it really transformed my relationship to my career, which was fortunate because I was feeling super burnt out. And now I'm in this awesome place where I get to combine the interests and the skills, the soft skills of improv with the hard skills of deep prescription and metabolic health.
And probably in the States, that term improv humor is well understood. I don't think it is so much in the UK. I certainly didn't really know what it is. So maybe tell us a bit more about what improv humor is. Perhaps you'd recommend a couple of, there obviously won't be as good as you, but a couple of other improv comedians that if people wanted the second and third best comedians that they might follow.
Sure. So I'll start with what it's not. So when I meet people, they say, I had this really funny thing happen to me. You can use it for your stand-up. Well, stand-up comedy is Ricky Gervais on a stage telling jokes, joke, punchline, one person microphone giving that humor. Improv comedy is a form of comedy. It's like a form of theater where everything's made up. So it could be a small group or a large group that gets on stage, whatever format it is. You get a suggestion from the audience and you use that suggestion to create whatever form of improvisational humor that it is. So everything is made up on the spot. The characters, the dialogue, the setting, everything is made up. And it could be as short as a minute game that you might see on Whose Line Is It Anyway, which I would just have if you've never seen improv comedy, look up in general old clips of Whose Line Is It Anyway. You're going to see Ryan Stiles, Colin Mockery, Wayne Brady, and I'm missing a few other great improvisers there. I think that's a great gateway. We talk about gateway drugs to low carb. It's a great gateway drug into improv comedy. And from there, everything is made up on the spot. And like I said, it could be as little as a minute. I've done improv where we hear a story told and we do 60 minutes based on that story, or we do improvised rapping and that rapping inspires improv. So there's a million different formats of it, but the basic premise is it's all made up. So you go on stage and you don't know what you're going to say, which for most pharmacists would make us terrified. We like to have everything buttoned up and neat. And so that was a really great opportunity to grow and get uncomfortable in a cool setting and have fun with it.
And I know, and again, you've mentioned it briefly, but I'd like to delve a bit more deeply because in a sense, you're straddling two completely different worlds. The whole serious science pharmacist stuff, and then there's this wacky improv humor. But actually, in your practice, you found a way to bring those together. So you don't see them as two separate worlds, do you? You see them as complementary.
I do. In improvisation, when I tell people I do this, they'll say, Cory, I could never do improv. I'm not that funny. And I tell them, well, I'm living proof. You don't need to be that funny to be a successful improviser. Because if you're an intelligent person that can hold a conversation, like what we're doing right now is improvised. We don't have a script that we didn't sit down and type out what we're going to say. Every day in our interactions, we're improvising. And so people think you have to be like really thinking and be funny to come up with funny things on stage. when the reality is improvisation when done well, and I think this is healthcare when done well, is living in the moment with that person in front of you, listening and responding honestly and making a connection with that human being in front of you. And I think that's a lot of what we've lost in healthcare. And that's, I think, a lot of what has driven us to this low carb space is we've been ignored. The science has been ignored. We get frustrated because no one will be willing to listen. And so the way I apply it is really working on that human connection with my patients. And in the course of our conversation, I pick up on what they care about, what they're interested in, how their life's going. And then I weave in the clinical side because it's just a conversation with a human. And, it used to be I'd get a patient and they'd say something off the wall and I just, really get nervous and what I'm supposed to do. Now I take the job seriously, but I see every interaction is just as a game, right? I'm working with them. It's a game to figure out what they care about, what their challenges are, and make that connection in the limited 20 to 40 minutes I get with a patient.
No, I couldn't agree more. I think as medicine, and it's probably perhaps pharmacy is the worst, but I think it's true for all the medical professions. As we become more and more specialized, I mean, you can now see a specialist surgeon who only does lower eyelids. That's
impressive.
And they're very, very good at it, right? But we've taken this so far and we have forgotten. I mean, I think the fundamental failure of medicine, modern medicine, is to look at the organic whole of the body and treat it as if the lower eyelid is completely separate from any other part of the body. Heaven forbid they should deal with the upper eyelid.
Right. Well, and I think I agree with you there is that our bodies and minds are all connected, and we can touch on the mental health piece that I think we learned a lot at the conference that we were at last month. But yeah, we fragment things, and I think I talk about it in my book, how I don't enjoy getting punted. We have the term here in America where you're punted from one specialty to another, and no one ever really addresses the root issue. And pretending that your lungs are separated from your heart, separated from your brain, separated from your muscular structure. Like, yes and no. Like, you want a specialist if you need a heart procedure, but to pretend that it doesn't somehow have some effect from your mental health or from anything else is sort of foolish and hubristic. I think that we humans think we can compartmentalize everything into these little specialties when it's not always that simple.
No, I think that's right. I often use the analogy of the car, right? So you take your car in for its annual check and they say, it's not stopping very well. Your tyres are a bit worn, we'll replace the tyres. The tyres aren't the problem, the brakes are failing. Yeah, right. I mean, so new tyres are maybe a good thing, but we didn't look at that. We just looked at, the tyres because we're tyre specialists.
Hey, it's good for big tire.
Yeah, it's good for big tire. Yeah, exactly that. And I say it all the time. And I think for me, the joy of general practice medicine and general practice pharmacy is that, and particularly for pharmacists, is I think our huge strength that we see people very frequently. We see them when they don't see themselves as patients, they see themselves as human beings leading a life. Part of their life is diabetes, but they don't want to be seen as a diabetic, right? And we can see their illness or their unwellness or their dis-ease in the context of the rest of their lives. And which is why I'm so enthusiastic about the practice of community pharmacy done right, done holistically, and not overly dominated by the ever-increasing use of meds.
Right. Yeah, and I think it comes down, it sounds so simple, but it's done so poorly. It's just seeing that patient as a human being, not a prescription number, not a diagnosis, but as this mother, father, son, daughter, person who's trying to be a productive worker. All of that gets lost when we just boil things down to a diagnosis or a prescription number.
Yeah. And then we become obsessed with, I think HbA1c, which everyone with diabetes appears to be obsessed with, it's a terrible measure. And it really doesn't speak to, I'm in my early 60s now. My children are now having children. And my ambition is to be able to do everything with my grandchildren that I used to do with my kids. Right? That is a million miles away from my HbA1c. I mean, I know my HbA1c is in there somewhere in the mix, but it doesn't dominate my thinking. And that's why we called the program ProLongevity, live a longer, healthier life. We didn't call it overweight or obesity or diabetes, all those other things that we could have called it, specifically because we didn't want to be compartmentalized in that illness treatment paradigm.
Yeah, and I think that's a beautiful way of putting it. Unfortunately, I see many people that are 20s and 30s that are not thriving. And to thrive deep into your life as healthily as you can, I think I'm a little bit younger than you, but we have young kids. So, I've been told I look younger than my age, so I'll take that as a compliment. But my dad recently had open heart surgery. He had a one vessel cabbage, but he was active before, he's active after, and he's almost 70 and is able to do a lot of most of the stuff he's always liked to do anyway. And yeah, like you say, it's not just a lab number. It's, do you have the musculature? Do you have the mental capacity to do it? And unfortunately, I'm seeing people younger and younger who are on a path they're not vibrant in their 20s. Like your 20s, like we all look back longingly on our 20s. I wish I was 23 again. Oh my gosh. I was so young, and I'm in my mid 30s now, and I feel as vibrant and energetic as I was in my 20s. And I was told that 30 is when it starts to go downhill, which is, it doesn't have to be that if you take care of yourself in a way that's, not the mainstream way of taking care of yourself, maybe a little bit different than, the way that we like to approach things.
Well, I know I may look like an old man, but in my head, I'm roughly 35. So you and I are basically the same age.
Exactly. Right. I'm glad to know I'm not the only one. I look in the mirror, I look at my birthday. I'm like, I don't feel like a grown up sometimes. I mean, I have a job and kids and things. So it's good to know that we're atypical in another way. It's good to be a good company.
I say this a lot, that you can measure age in two different ways, and they're completely different paradigms. The conventional way of measuring age is the difference between today and the day you were born.
Mm-hmm.
I went to a birthday party recently, and a whole group of friends, there must have been 40 of us, and it was a 60th birthday. So all the people in that room were, let's say, between 50 and 70.
Mm-hmm.
If you'd been a Martian hovering above the room, you'd have seen two completely different subspecies. A group of people who are probably in their 80s, who are clearly overweight, not well, look quite frail, probably on their way to diabetes, hypertension, and all the rest of it. And a completely separate group of people who were probably 40 and looked fit and vibrant and happy and dynamic and. We were all the same age.
Yeah.
So it's exactly what you said, that we kind of accept this as, all these are chronic progressive diseases. They're inevitable. You're going to catch them. You're going to develop them. And there's nothing you can do except take ever more medication.
Mm-hmm.
None of that's true. None of that's true.
And that's the thing I'll tell my patients is I'll ask them, do you want to reverse this? And no one's ever given them that option. And and I think that observation is so true. I joke with my wife, I saw someone, I see someone today that was the oldest looking 4-year-old I've ever seen. And then I saw a woman in clinic just a couple of days ago who said she was 82 and she was literally bouncing off the walls. Like she was just, I'm like, you're kidding me, right? There's no way you're 82. And so it's not, I don't say that path to aging virally is an easy path. The easy path is to kind of give into our food environment and live that way. But if it isn't more rewarding, just looking at you and how vibrant you were and meeting you in person and how energetic you, and as you say, those people in the room that are just two different subspecies at this point.
So to put some numbers on it, and I'm sure you know this thing that we call metabolic syndrome, which is this kind of cluster of diseases that start with obesity, but they're not actually directly correlated. Well, they're correlated but not caused by obesity, but that's what everyone concentrates on. Cardiovascular disease, diabetes, cancer, dementia are all broadly the same disease played out in different body systems with fundamentally the same root causes and fundamentally the same processes at the level of the cell, at the subcellular level and at the level of the organism. And there are 5 diagnostic criteria for a metabolic syndrome: blood pressure, raised lipids or deranged lipids, poor glucose control, etc. And if you have 3 out of any of those 5 diagnostic criteria, then you can be said to have metabolic syndrome.
Mm-hmm.
What the point is, and this is the shocking point, the latest statistics in the US, where these data are gathered rather well, is that only 7% of US adults don't meet any of the diagnostic criteria for metabolic syndrome.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
To put it another way, the whole of the US is going to have diabetes in 10 years' time if it carries on as it is. It's horrendous.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know the study and know the statistic, and it's I have the smile on my face because I'm just naturally trying to be pleasant, but it's sad. Like it is just. I was talking on another podcast the other day, and it's just I feel like we're losing our birthright to vibrancy, vitality, and health, and no one seems to. What gets me is that I'll hear diabetes runs in my family, and so I'm 36. I was born in 1986. They had to come up with this. The metabolic syndrome didn't really exist then. Like I tell my students this, that long before, because I'm getting older, like long before they were born, like we didn't have metabolic syndrome. We had to come up with it starting in the late 80s and 90s. Non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. Fatty liver disease was alcoholic liver disease. Like we didn't have non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, and now we do. And everyone just sort of like shrugs their shoulders and says, well, I guess this is inevitable because it's genetic. Like in the 1920s, it wasn't in your genetics. I think that there are certain propensities that make you more susceptible to it, but it doesn't mean that you are like genetically going to get it. It's just our environment is really turning on that poor health that's giving that metabolic syndrome, metabolic disease.
And the other statistic I often mention is the amount of calories. I mean, I ultra processed food or junk food, I basically describe it as poison with added calories.
Yeah.
And there's no doubt. I mean, the US is in so many ways leads the world, and it leads the world in its consumption of ultra processed food. I think 70% of calories in the US come from ultra processed food. Mm-hmm. And we Brits follow our American cousins quite closely. So we're probably 65% of our calories. And the UK is notoriously the sick man of Europe. Mm-hmm. We've got all sorts of problems with our economy. And post-COVID, of course, everything is being stress tested to destruction. Mm-hmm. And nothing is coping. I mean, worldwide systems are struggling to cope. I don't know that the NHS is doing any worse. But as a nation, we're doing worse than the rest of Europe. And that's not the fault of the NHS. That's got to do with the amount of ultra-processed food that we consume. And we consume in the UK more ultra-processed food than any other part of Europe. It really is that simple. Mm-hmm. And I sort of talk about, the history of all this. 120 years ago, metabolic syndrome didn't exist. And the major killers, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, cancer, dementia, they were just not seen. Mm-hmm. They were incredibly rare. And now the 2 biggest killers, cancer and cardiovascular disease, came from nowhere in literally 100 years as our diet changed.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And it's my wife and I, it's funny. We have a 2 and 4-year-old, and we're pretty strict with what we let them eat. And we'll go to their sports practice, and the rule is one parent brings a snack for all the kids, and we'll look at it and we'll say, and these are well-meaning, affluent parents who've been told to bring, and I'm using air quotes for the listeners, healthy snacks. Yeah. And we look at the packages, and like, there's no food in these foods. As you say, they're poisoned with calories, and it's hard because it's easy, and parents are stressed and they're busy. And it says healthy on it, or it says healthy whole grains this, or it's organic fruit bar that. But we counted one night, there was 70 grams of sugar. You're giving a bunch of 4-year-olds at 7 p.m. trying to go to bed after a t-ball practice. Like it's ubiquitous, and it's become the norm. And we'll talk a little bit about some of our favorite moments from Low Carb Denver, but it really goes to show how far we've come from how far our food system has gone off course and normalized eating garbage.
And it's kind of while you were talking, because I made all these mistakes with my children because I was ignorant.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm hoping not to repeat all those mistakes with my grandchildren because I'm not ignorant anymore.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm much more frustrated now because I can see it happening in front of my eyes. How do you manage this? Because you've got young kids.
Mm-hmm.
You don't want to poison them with junk food, but they're subject to all the norms of society. How do you manage that?
Well, the good news is they're still under our little thumbs for now. They're 2 and 4. The first step is we model it. So Cassie's my wife. I guess you pick it up from context there. We eat, we aren't quote keto, but we eat a pretty lowish carb diet of whole foods and very, very little to any like processed junk food. And that's what our kids get from the first food they got. They never got baby food. They never got anything from a baby food manufacturer. Not saying it's good or bad. We would just cut up our food into smaller bites, and that's what they got. The rules that we followed were the first year they didn't get anything sweet. So no fruit for the first year. So they didn't develop any penchant for sweetness. After year 2, they got to have dark chocolate, and now they're in the 2 and higher. If they go to a birthday party and there's a cookie or a cake, we don't want to give them an eating disorder either. So we don't put a lot of energy into it. Like when they're at our house or with our families, we control what they're eating. When they're at school and they have an Oreo cookie for part of their Christmas celebration with Santa Claus, like I'm not going to ruin Christmas for them because the other 90% of the time they're getting protein. Our rule is you got to eat your protein if you want to have a treat. And our treat literally is frozen berries and heavy cream poured over it with cocoa powder, like cacao. Like that's their treat. Of course, like when it's Halloween, they get candy, they get a couple pieces, but we're really diligent and mindful of how we talk about food. We try not to say sugar bad. We'll say this has a lot of sugar and it won't help you grow big muscles because our kids like working out and playing sports and stuff. So they want to have big muscles and be strong. So we'll say this food will help make you stronger. This food won't make you as strong. We don't judge. And then we'll make like different versions of food. So we don't have pancakes. We do we call them power cakes where we'll take eggs and cottage cheese and psyllium husk and just mix it all together. So it looks like a pancake, like little modifications like that. But one of my proudest moments, or maybe I'm a terrible parent, we went for ice cream after they had to go to the doctor, which isn't always fun. And my in-laws got us gift cards to an ice cream shop. They never had real ice cream before. We just would take heavy cream, frozen berries, blend it up and call it air quote ice cream. So we went to the ice cream shop. We got a real ice cream. They had some. And they went home and said, I like our ice cream more. And I was just like, yes. All right.
It won't last, Cory. Trust me, it won't last.
I know we are. Well, and the thing is, like I said, we don't put a ton of energy into it. We're at an age now where they're going to birthday parties. And if they want to have a piece of cake there, as long as they've had some protein before, like some healthy protein and fat before, like fill up on the other stuff and then have cake and don't give them a complex about like, I'm eating cake, it's bad. I'm like, no, we're enjoying this. It's a celebration. But for the most part, and the teachers at school have not to be hubristic, but they really appreciate the lunches we send because some of these kids, they'll say they get Cheetos and an applesauce. And I'm like, this is so sad that's what they get. So our kids get, I tell my wife, I'm so like, it's a labor of love, and I'm so tired of making lunches and preparing food on Sundays for the week, but it's worth it. So
it's the best investment you can make in your children's health and well-being. And have you, obviously at the ages of 2 and 4, you've got a good degree of parental control.
Mm-hmm.
And you obviously haven't entirely bumped into this, but have you thought about a strategy as they become more independent and you have less control? Have you thought through how you can make that work?
It's funny.
Get that.
No, we're thinking ahead, and maybe we overthink it. But again, Cassie, she works for a company that does diabetes reversal with diet, so we're very well versed in the low carb metabolic world. So we deal with the consequences every day with our patients. So we've been very mindful and intentional about how we're going to deal with it. And I think our thought is, again, we don't want to put this crazy restrictive energy, because when you restrict stuff in kids and teenagers, they just rebel hard against it. So I think our approach is, in our house, we will cook healthy whole foods. We will send you out with healthy whole foods. And when you go to a friend's house and you're out with friends, you eat what you want, but you don't bring it back to our house. So that in theory would limit the amount of exposure. And I think if we put a ton of energy into saying how quote bad something is, that just makes teenagers want to do it more. So if we just say, hey, did you go out to your friend's house? Did you go to the fast food place? Was it good? Awesome. How did you feel afterwards? Terrible. Okay, remember that. Now we're gonna have our dinner. So, but I think we model it. Like Cassie and I eat the same. We all eat the same dinner. We don't make them special kids foods. So we model it together, and it's just not really. It's all they've known. And maybe in 20 years they'll come back to therapy and hate us for depriving them of all the sweets. But the argument I make with parents is it's hard. You're the grandparent, but you're an atypical grandparent, because most grandparents want to push sugary stuff on their grandkids to give them treats. My parents and in-laws are the same way, but for us, it's giving them that opportunity to be healthy, and trying to explain to my parents why that's the hill we die on is what they're eating. So I hope that provided some answer in how we're approaching this. With
I'll interview again in 20 years when I'm in my 80s. Fit environment, and you'll be able to tell me how it played out. Okay.
Yeah, and we're at a place now where, like, if my mom wants to make cookies with them, like, I'm not going to stop her. But it's the first few years. A great book that I recommend that I'm sure a lot of us in this world listening to this might know, Deep Nutrition by Kate Shanahan, Dr. Shanahan. It was really formative for us in approaching how we wanted to approach food with the kids, and especially in the early years when your taste buds are being formed and your preferences are being formed and those neuronal pathways are being etched into your brain. So making sure that we weren't giving them this like need for sweets or whatever that might be as well.
Brilliant. In fact, we'll link to that in the show notes, because I don't think that's so well known in the UK.
Yeah.
So that's fascinating. We've talked about Low Carb Denver en passant, but I'd like to talk a bit more about that. As we were discussing before we started, I've just come back from Low Carb Denver. I came away utterly inspired. Mm-hmm. I had the best time. For all sorts of reasons. A lot of those people have been on my podcast, but I've never met them. To meet Ken Berry face to face, and all these people that a lot of whom I feel I know, but I haven't met. Quite a few have been on our podcast that we've never met. Meeting them face to face was just a joy. Mm-hmm. And the warm and friendly nature of the people. I mean, we'll come on to this. Also, it was such an enjoyable. When did anyone really enjoy a medical conference? Well, I had an absolute blast.
Yes.
So how did you get involved with Low Carb Denver, and then say a bit more about the role that you had there?
So I got involved with Low Carb Denver. I was at another low carb conference that was put on by the Society of Metabolic Health Practitioners in San Diego in August of 2022. While I was there, I met a person, kind of talked about my book, and gave an interview for them. And then one of the organizers for Low Carb Denver was talking to this person, and they're like, "Oh, we need an MC for Low Carb Denver." And she's like, "Oh, I met this guy who's a pharmacist, but he's kind of funny, and he has this book, and let me just introduce you." So I was able to meet up with Berkeley, who helped Dr. Gerber with Low Carb Denver. Met Dr. Gerber on Zoom, and he said, "So you're a pharmacist that does comedy?" I was like, "Yeah." He's like, "What the blankety blank does that have to do with one another?" I was like, "We're going to get on great." So I was able to convince them to give me the keys to the first couple of days of their conference as the MC. And so that's how I got involved. And then I was the MC for the first couple of days, ran the awards dinner Saturday night. And I can tell you it was an honor and a blast to meet all of these people. As you say that I don't have a podcast, but I've heard them on podcasts, read their books, watched their videos, learned so much from them. And a few takeaways I would say is that, as you say, it was a medical conference that was fun. That was my goal as the MC. I'm a comedian, so make it educational and fun. I had a few pharmacist colleagues that I convinced to come there, and from America here. And they were like, "This is like no other conference I've ever been to, because we're enjoying ourselves. It's not stuffy. Like, you can be professional and have fun." And I think pharmacy takes the professional and stuffs the fun out of anything that we try to do. So it was warm. The graciousness of the speakers to spend time with people who would just come up and randomly ask them questions. You don't get that. I feel like there's very little ego. at these conferences from the speakers, because we've all been humbled, right? We've all been practicing a certain way, found out that it's not working, and had to go back to the drawing board. So I think the humility that I see, and the desire to serve people, like we talked about, to help turn about this 7% of healthy people and turn it into flip that upside down. Let's get 90% of people who are metabolically healthy. And then, as you said, it was an enjoyable, fun environment that was where we learned a lot of new, great information as well.
And I had some of the best steaks I've had in a long time.
There you go. USA, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think you did a fantastic job. I think you had to leave on the final day, so we missed you. But Jeff Gerber, again, who I feel like I know him, but we hadn't met previously. Uh-huh. He introduced the two of us ahead of time, so we had a bit of a chat for that. And yeah, we're best buddies now, aren't we?
Yeah. This is great. To meet future me in a different country. A few years my elder, but doing the atypical pharmacist thing is a thrill. And what was, I think, heartening to me is I've met 4 or 5 other pharmacists at the conference. So there were a growing contingent of I think for us, we can position ourselves, have the nutrition knowledge, but we have the expertise and safely, because people forget how dangerous drugs can be. And if you change your diet, it can be very dangerous if we don't appropriately get people off the medicines. And who better positioned to follow up closely with patients to get them off their meds in a safe manner than pharmacists. So I think it was a perfect conference for pharmacists to come to as well.
I agree. I mean, I'd like the network of low carb tends to be mainly dominated by doctors and nurses. There's a few dentists. There's the odd ophthalmologist, Chris Kenobi, who's become a good pal of mine. I don't know if you got to meet him. Pharmacists are relatively few and far between, but what I find interesting is whenever I do a podcast or I talk on a sort of pharmacy platform, so many pharmacists come up to me and say, Graham, we knew this. We know you're right. And thank God we've discovered you, because we want to find a way not to follow this traditional path. Pharmacists are very well versed in the science and very much understand this concept of NNT and NNH. So the numbers need to treat. So if you treat 100 people, how many of them will benefit and by how much? How many of them will be harmed and by how much? Mm-hmm. And anyone who's looked at my podcasts on statins will know that we go quite deep into this. So I'm not going to get into that here. People, in a lay way, people assume things either they work or they don't. Mm-hmm. And either they're safe and they're not, or they're not. Mm-hmm. And that's nothing like that.
Right.
I help a certain percentage of people in a certain amount of way, to a certain extent, and they do harm. Mm-hmm. And the whole point about medicine is first do no harm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And we've forgotten that balance of benefit-harm relationships, particularly in the case of statin, because it's such a good example. Mm-hmm. And so it's this kind of blanket. I said I wasn't going to get into it. Now I am. Everyone should be on a statin. Well, I don't think so. So I want to see, and I keep saying this to the NHS, effectively our masters in the UK. The way that we're paid in pharmacy tends to be a paper chase, ever more prescriptions, because that feeds our income. Why don't you pay us to deprescribe? Because we've got all those skills, but we've got no incentives. Because if we were deprescribing, I mean, to give you context, and I don't know the figures in the US, the whole bill for UK pharmacy is less than £3 billion. The drugs bill is 20 billion. And the total bill for medicine for GPs is 10. So the UK drugs bill is double the cost of having all the GPs and 7 times the cost of having all the pharmacists.
Yeah.
And yet the entire system is driving the drugs bill inexorably upwards. And I would argue with limited benefits, and arguably we're doing more harm than good. Mm-hmm. I offer to the NHS, why don't you pay us to try and help that sort that out, rather than paying us to always generate more prescriptions?
Mm-hmm.
And that's the paradigm shift. I was on the Diet Doctor podcast and I discussed this with Brett Share, and I've sent that to a lot of pharmacists, and they say, you're right. You're absolutely right. So I completely, we're furiously agreeing with each other, which comes as no great surprise. It was an outstanding, inspiring. My head is still buzzing. I mean, it's a month on, and my head is still buzzing with the positivity and the joy of the conference. And I know that I'll recreate that because I'm interviewing quite a few people post-conference. For you, what stood out? What of all this? There wasn't one bad presentation. There was nothing that was less than good, and some of it was excellent and inspiring. Mm-hmm. What inspired you the most?
So I have to say, the conference kicked off Friday morning with Dr. Bill Schindler, who's an anthropologist, and someone I have to say I'm biased towards. My wife and I had watched his show, The Great Human Race, and met him in person at the conference the night before, and we're like, "You were on TV. You're the guy that we watch." And with 2- and 4-year-old, we don't get much time to watch TV, so the fact we spent the time to watch it. But he talked a lot about we talk about ultra processed food. But what really blew me away from his talk is that humans have basically been we've been processing our food for thousands of years. It's just the way that we process it is totally gone awry. And our relationship with food and our food system has gone sideways. And I bought his book, Eat Like a Human, and read it in about 3 days because a bunch of it are recipes that I'm excited to try. But between his talk and his book, I just come away with we couldn't have messed up our relationship with food more if we had tried. Between the traditional ways of fermenting dairy, and I know hold your pearls, low carb people, but grains, he talks a lot about fermented sourdough breads and how the processing of that actually makes it a little bit less glycemic index, a little bit more. We talk about the importance of protein, and that's just one example how we messed up our relationship with eating with animals. All of these things with corn, and how traditional cultures would process corn in a way that was less impactful on blood sugar, higher protein. There's a theme here, less carb, higher protein sort of approach. And I came away inspired to try some of this for my own family. His book talks a lot about how we nourish our own family. He talks about foraging. We foraged outside our house because it's been rainy here in the desert this winter. So we had some wild arugula growing. So we foraged and made a salad out of it and got our kids involved. So how we can really create that family environment we talk about raising kids with food earlier, right? And how I'm going to ferment some sauerkraut with the cabbage I grow in my garden. So it's this very actionable things that we as humans have done. And he started it off by cutting a stone in half and say, everything changed when we figured out how to process food with something that we can cut. It grabbed our attention right away, and I was hooked. So that for me was a really cool visit through human history to see where we've come from and how badly we've gone off track.
I agree. I find it absolutely inspiring, and I'm very aware that my knowledge of cardiometabolic disease and the origins of these illnesses is pretty good, but my knowledge of the anthropology that prehistory is very poor. I did have a good chat with him, and I've also bought his book. I haven't had a chance to look at it yet. Mm-hmm. But yes, as health professionals, we're kind of born into this milieu of escalating metabolic syndrome, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, obesity, call it what you want, right? And we're just thrown out there. And none of us ever say, well, hang about, none of us know that 120 years ago that those diseases didn't exist, right? Yeah. It's genetic, it's environmental, nothing you can do. What do we do? What's our approach? Our approach is diagnose early and treat with the drugs.
Yeah. Aggressive early intervention is intervention being the medicines and not the diet.
Yeah. So, the latest thing in the UK is the NHS is just about to start providing Wegovy.
Oh, great.
Right?
Yeah.
And okay, I have to say, if we're going to use that, there are much worse drugs, and there are some good things about it. It takes away your appetite, you lose weight, makes you more insulin sensitive. What's not to like? Well, I tell you what's not to like. When you come off the drug, you put the weight back on.
Yep.
And the evidence is that 40% of the weight that you lose while you're on the drug is muscle. Yep. So when you put the weight back on, you've substituted fat for muscle. And one of the best predictors of healthy longevity is retaining your muscle mass. Mm-hmm. no, the drug company doesn't mention any of that, and that's the route that we're going down. And I think the NHS has kind of convinced itself this is a good thing. Well, it might not be a bad thing, but I think there are much better things involving eating real food and understanding the origins of where this came from. So, yeah, I think I agree with you. Bill was an absolutely outstanding, fascinating talk. Inspired me, made me realise how ignorant I am. And I bought the book. I'm in the process of reading something else, but it's on my list. And I'm very much hope that we can get Bill on the podcast, maybe with a bit of support for you. Perhaps you can leverage that a bit. For me, that was it. The most outstanding, inspiring talk was Chris Palmer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I suppose it's partly because I think we do. He talks about the role of diet, not because I've always understood that, cardiometabolic health, the level of the cell and the level and the organism is driven by what you eat. Mm-hmm. And I've understood this link between all these metabolic syndrome diseases. Mm-hmm. I'd never really understood how all those diseases are linked with mental health, poor mental health as well. Mm-hmm. I kind of got the bit about the microbiome. I'm quite good with that. But he's got this entire unifying theory of mental health based on mitochondria, which is the battery of the cell. If the batteries in your cell are not working very well, your cells will misfire, you'll give off free radicals. That produces a kind of cascade of inflammation. And your mitochondria basically dominate everything. Mm-hmm. And for a psych, normally they don't know anything about cell metabolism. And here's a guy that must have several PhDs in cell metabolism, as well as other knowledge. And he described the pain, and it's in his family. So he's been quite honest himself on various podcasts about the fact that he struggled with his mental health and struggled with his metabolism and stumbled across low carb, healthy eating as a way to reverse his metabolic syndrome. Mm-hmm. And when he reversed his metabolic syndrome, his mental health improved radically and quickly. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And he'd never expected it. And then he started to try it on patients and started getting incredible results and decided to look into it. And he's now managed to get huge amount of funding from a very wealthy American family, the Bazooki family. They've created this thing called the Bazooki Foundation. Mm-hmm. And I've got Brett Sher coming on the podcast in a few weeks, so we'll talk about it in detail. I think that guy has the potential to revolutionize the world's mental health in the same way the leaders in our space have the potential to revolutionize cardiovascular health. Mm-hmm. But it wasn't just that. You could see at certain points he was talking about the journeys of his patients and his own journey. And his eyes were filled with tears as he described the pain that these people suffer, the inadequacy of the system, the fact that these people are constrained to the scrap heap because there's nothing the health system can do for them. And their lives are worthless. And we don't say that for people with diabetes, do we? We say, you've got diabetes, we'll give you some drugs to help you. But we don't sort of say, you're diabetic, that makes you hopeless and worthless. No one would do that. But in the area of mental health, it's all your fault and, just put yourself together and, Mm-hmm. And he described, you could see him fighting the emotion as he described the journey. And you can see the absolute and utter passion and commitment of one of the most inspiring health professionals I've ever met, talking about this and trying to create the science, because in the end, everything we has to do that we do as health professionals has to be justified on the basis of the science. Mm-hmm. He's kept the science and the humanity on track. Mm-hmm. It blew me away. I was nearly in tears at the end of it.
Yeah, and it's. I've seen him talk at a couple other conferences as well, and I've actually seen him bring patients up on stage of his and other patients who've been affected by the change in metabolic health. And like you say, it's people who've been told there's nothing we can do. Your lives are worthless. Too bad. And it's that it being ignored. A lot of what circling way back to the, how do you do improv with patients? If I do it well, if I'm using my skills well, patients will feel seen, heard, and understood. I will acknowledge their reality. I will acknowledge their challenges. I will acknowledge my own shortcomings, and we will work together on a plan together. And I think that in this world of mental health, metabolic health, what I have found would have driven a lot of us into this space is that we've tried everything else. My patients tried everything. At a last ditch effort, I tried this crazy low carb thing, or I tried this crazy carnivore thing, and then it worked. Yeah. And we just sort of like the most doctors would just kind of shrug and say, "Oh, what do you know?" Or, "Oh, you're going to get a heart attack now." It's like, but I feel good and everything else is improving. Well, you've just ignored the reality of this human being in front of you. And so for Chris to follow that curiosity, he did it himself. That's kind of, what I did. My wife has done, what you've done. We do it. We feel good. We look into the science. It seems legit. We talk to our patients about it. Some of them get better. And as you say, we talk number needed to treat. Not every patient is successful with a diet approach. Some struggle for various reasons. But when you look at a number needed to treat for a drug to improve weight versus, our standard of care versus a low carb approach where that number needed to treat could be 2, 3, or 4, or 5. Even if you're under 10 for the cost of this cheap intervention of taking drugs off and doing diet, it's still wildly better than our standard of care. And our mental health standard of care is terrible. Look at like our world, our global world is suffering, and this is speculation, but how much of it is environment? How much of it is the food that we were eating that's different?
Yeah,
I don't know. I can't tell you, but I can only tell you that when people change their diet, I've had patients say, or it was a specific patient that it was their daughter who I talked to. It was like, my dad's not depressed anymore, and he has energy, and his sugars are better, and he's lost weight, and he doesn't have the PTSD symptoms. I'm like, we can't ignore this. He got his life back. Let's give everyone else a chance at their life back. I tell patients there's no magic silver bullet that will fix this, but what you're doing is not working. Let's do something different. And I think the thing, maybe a theme to wrap up our, we work really hard in our space because we're, as Dr. Gerber said, we're the outsiders. We're the anti-establishment. And I'm not saying, I won't speak for our whole community, but it doesn't have to be low carb or nothing, but let it be a freaking option. Like the pushback on just letting it be, like, we don't think twice if we try metformin or insulin or a statin. Well, what if we try this? What if we try this diet thing for 3 weeks, 4 weeks, 5 weeks? Like, no one got a heart attack from eating a diet. Well, I can't say no one, but statistically, it's very unlikely that the 4 or 5 week trial of a diet you do is going to dramatically change your cardiovascular risk in the next couple of months. And if what you're doing is not working, let it be an option. That's my big argument and passion and plea.
Brilliant. And I think that's an inspiring place to stop. One thing I do want to mention is your book. So just tell us a little bit about your book and tell us a little bit about where does Cory go from here? Ideally. Anyway.
Well, if Cory can go back to bed, we're recording at 6 a.m. here in Tucson. So my kids, if I wanted to get anything done, I got to get up early. But my book is called Permission to Care, Building a Healthcare Culture That Thrives in Chaos. And it is essentially my distillation of the lessons I've learned as an improviser and how to apply them in healthcare. And so the title Permission to Care, I think it screams out to the frontline healthcare professional that's wanting to do the right thing for their patients, that's wanting to help them. And you can give yourself that permission to care by applying a lot of these skills. Healthcare culture that thrives in chaos. Healthcare is chaotic. COVID was the icing on the cake pardon, it's a low carb podcast, but icing on the cake of chaos. And so
low carb icing.
Low carb icing. There we go.
Yeah, it had allulose in it. Yeah.
A lot of our angst comes from wanting to, especially pharmacists, trying to control things beyond our control. So improv has taught me to let go of control and really turn chaos into an asset. And it's for that frontline healthcare professional, for the healthcare leadership looking to build a better culture. It's a very light read. I've been told that by others that they laugh out loud reading it. So I incorporate a lot of the funny stories of my career. And so that's just a distillation of what I go and for where I go from here, I MC low carb events. I MC other events. I go and speak on the application of improv to healthcare. So whether it's a keynote address or doing workshops with the healthcare professionals at the front line, That's what I do in addition to my pharmacy practice, in addition to being a parent, in addition to trying to maintain a semblance of health too. So I keep busy, but it's a happy life, doing all these things that really inspire me and keep me energized. It's why I get up at 4 a.m. to come on a podcast to talk to you. I love it.
Mad, I wouldn't have done it. Particularly, I wouldn't have done it today. And the book's available in all the usual places, is it?
Yes, the little tiny bookstore called Amazon. It's there for the buy-in. And if I meet if anyone's listening and they bought it and they want a signed copy, let me know. We'll make it happen. I love doing that for people too.
Brilliant. So we'll link to that. And it just occurs to me, it's not a promise, but I get involved in quite a lot of pharmacy conferences, and they often want someone to come and rough the audience up a bit. So let's see, maybe we can bring you over and get you on the stage, get the pharmacists a bit inspired and a bit laughing.
I'd love that. That would be an honor and fun. So,
so Cory, thanks so much for getting up at an ungodly hour to speak to us.
Oh, I'm up this early every day. If I want to get, like I said, if I want anything done, I got to beat my. If I say beat my kids up, that'll sound terrible. I have to get up before them to get anything done.
And we'll keep in touch.
That sounds great. I'd love that.
All right. All the best.
So I'm a weirdo as a pharmacist. I do comedy. I'm into fitness, nutrition, diet, getting people off meds. How is this applicable? How do I do this? And it really just comes down to one word: listening. Comedy has taught me to be a better listener. Improv has helped to shrink my ego down to tiny little bits to make me realize I don't know everything and that I have to rely on my team. And so it's this curiosity, this willingness to listen, to sit with a patient or someone with a different idea. And instead of just immediately saying no, in improv we say yes, and we agree to the realities presented to us. And I was presented a different reality of how to treat diabetes and obesity back in 2016. I said yes. I went down the rabbit hole. I read lots of good books. And so now I'm a weirdo pharmacist. And when I'm with my patients, I really listen to them too. I am sort of on the low carb spectrum of diet advice. I'm on the high comedy side of providing a good, fun experience for my patients. But if someone comes to me that is in a sullen mood, I don't just immediately try to tell them a joke. I listen and meet them where they're at. If someone comes to me and they're eating a vegan diet and they're crushing it with their goals, I say, keep it up, good work. If everything's looking good, awesome, right? We have to accept what our patients are going to give us. We have to accept the reality. We have to listen, be curious, and control those controllables in the healthcare system to improve that experience. And that's what I do. I take this weird mix of pharmacy and comedy and metabolic health. I mush it all together, and I try to make a better experience for my patients and get them healthier.